Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well. Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming, and we have a packed show today. I hope, again, that you are inspired and entertained by the guests that are going to come on. But right now, it is time for a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that states cannot disqualify federal candidates based on insurrection, overturning Colorado's decision to exclude Donald Trump from the ballot. Alan Weisselberg, former CFO of the Trump Organization, pled guilty to perjury related to financial statements. President Biden and Donald Trump both performed well in statewide nominating contests, highlighted by an impressive showing on Super Tuesday. Nikki Haley, who won both the District of Columbia and Vermont Republican primaries, suspended her campaign. Congressman Dean Phillips also ended his bid for the Democratic presidential nomination. Independent U.S. Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona announced that she will not seek re-election. President Biden and Donald Trump had contrasting visits to the Texas border, with Biden calling for bipartisan immigration reform and Trump criticizing the current administration's border policies. Alabama's legislature passed a bill to protect the in vitro fertilization industry following a state Supreme Court decision that frozen embryos should be considered children. President Biden signed a short-term spending bill to prevent a partial government shutdown, with deadlines to fund various parts of the government set for March 8th and March 22nd. Congress then swiftly passed a major budget bill to avert the March 8th deadline. An LGBTQ advocacy group obtained a temporary restraining order against Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton's demands for information on their work with transgender minors. CVS and Walgreens announced they will begin selling the abortion pill mifepristone in several states. Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis vetoed a bill that would have prohibited minors under 16 from using social media. A Colorado paramedic was sentenced to 5 years for the 2019 death of Elijah McClain, a black man who died after being restrained by police and injected with a sedative by medics. And a New Mexico jury found the armorer of the movie Rust guilty of involuntary manslaughter. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right, Grace, and thanks for that moment of news. It is good to have you back. I really missed you. And I think the audience missed you too. And I'm glad everything has worked out the way it is supposed to have gone for you. All right. Speaking about Grace, that happens to be the name of my next guest. Her name, or my first guest, I should say, is Grace Young Foster. Grace Young Foster is the founder and CEO of the Inclusion Initiative, a tech platform for professionals that is closing the opportunity gap for adoptees of color and foster care alumni. At 3 years old, she was orphaned and abandoned at a local market in South Korea and eventually ended up in the U.S. foster care system to be adopted. Her very difficult experience as a transracial adoptee and foster youth in a predominantly white community influenced her internalized racism and her decades-long pursuit of finding white belonging. Now she has created that belonging for those who share these intersectional identities through her company, the Inclusion Initiative. Grace is a former nonprofit executive with 15 years of experience in both the corporate and nonprofit sectors. She holds an MBA from NYU Stern School of Business. She also holds an associate's degree in business administration and a BA in communications from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Grace Young Foster. All right, Grace Young Foster. How you doing, ma'am? You doing good?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's an honor for me to have you on. You deal with adoptions, and we'll get into why in a minute, but that's a personal issue for me. I have had a privilege of, and people on the podcast have heard me mention it before, but I have had the privilege of being on a board dealing with adoptions and in the state of Mississippi. And it's not easy work to engage in. You would think that it would be some ease into it, but it's really, really complicated. And I think you're going to help the audience kind of understand those difficulties that people have. But before we get deep into the interview, there's always a starting point for me, and that's a quote. And so it's either something that you might have said, something you might have written, or something somebody else said that's related to the topic or the work that we're going to discuss. So this is your quote. There are those of us who have the great privilege of doing this work because we want to do it. Let us who lead in this space remember that. Let us honor those of us who do not carry this privilege, as it is for them we do this work. What does that quote mean to you?
Yeah, I love that you lifted that because our community is so vast. The adoptee community and folks who are foster care alum, we are a community that's often not represented in many of the spaces of our everyday lives, in society, at work, at school. And so that quote, what it really means to me is that there are so many in our community who do not have platforms or voices, right, that are listened to. And lived experience is such a crucial component of understanding, right? How we make the experience of adoption, of foster care, mainly for the people with lived experience, but also those who are taking youth into their homes to support them, love them, create family. But without centering the lived experience, we can't do that in a way that honors, right, those who are most impacted. And so those without voices or platforms that are listened to, it's really important for folks like me and many of my friends in this space who are doing this work to remember, right, that we are honoring them. We are honoring us. And so that's why that quote is really important to me. So thank you.
What is the Inclusion Initiative and why was it important to start?
The Inclusion Initiative is elevating the future of work for adoptees of color and foster care alumni. There's a real opportunity gap that many of us with lived experience face as we build careers. We enter the professional space because of the barriers and challenges, right, that we've navigated through and still navigate through because of our lived experience. And so we as adoptees or foster care alum, we don't choose to be in those positions, but as we enter our adult lives, there are a lot of barriers, challenges, misconceptions that we have to overcome to get to the same opportunities, the same levels in our careers and, reach our professional goals that many of our peers don't face. And so there are many adults in our community, many students in our community, many young professionals in our community who have experienced a significant opportunity gap because there's a lack of resources provided and a lack of visibility and network provided for those of us with this unique lived experience. So that's why the Inclusion Initiative was built.
So, talk to me about these terms: attachment disorder and reactive attachment disorder. It's something you kind of highlighted. You've got a series of newsletters, you have a newsletter. You have a series of essays that's on LinkedIn that talks about your experience, and in the second newsletter, I think it was second newsletter, you use these terms. Talk to me about what those terms mean and how much of an impact it has as far as adoptions go.
Sure. Those terms, attachment disorder and reactive attachment disorder, is associated with trauma and separation for kids that experience those things. And in general, right, what it means is kids that have been taken from their families, their original caretakers, right, their moms and dads, their birth moms and dads, and have had, right, that cut of separation from the only thing they've ever known and the only kind of, love they've ever experienced, and to be placed into an environment, right, where they are not with their parents of birth or families of origin or cultures of origin or the communities of origin. That's very traumatic. It's really traumatic. And kids as young as babies, and especially older kids, it impacts them deeply. And it can cause what's known as attachment disorder or reactive attachment disorder, especially when there's multiple traumatic events that have happened to a child where, right, they start to feel and believe that they can't trust people to take care of them because of these traumatic experiences. So they don't attach to the caretakers that they're placed into, right? The new caretakers in a new home. And because they don't attach, right, they don't form bonds or relationships, which impact them both, from a young age, and it can impact them all the way into their adulthood about how they're forming relationships and how they feel security, connection, and belonging.
So your cognitive journey as far as adoption goes, and I guess that's the best way I can describe it, because you don't know who your parents were, right? You have no idea,
That's right.
no connection. And your first memory, I guess, was when you were 3?
I think so. Yeah. My age is unknown. It's a best guess. And there are many adoptees that had my situation, right, where they don't know their names, they don't know their age, they don't know their place of birth. So at about 3, right, I remember being in orphanages in Korea, and that's really where my life journey starts for me.
And you spent about 2 years in that kind of system in Korea before this American couple who you described as upper middle class uh, professional educators came and
Hmm.
got you, right?
Right. That's right.
So they never officially adopted you. They just kind of took you in. Kind of explain that process.
Yes, the intention was to adopt. So I was a transnational adoptee, pending adoptee, I should say. And their intention, right, was to add me as a member of their family in the United States. But after about 2 years of me living in their home and integrating with the family they had multiple children of biologically. Um, they decided that I wasn't the right child for them. And they decided to separate and terminate their guardianship of me, and release me into the foster system.
Now, and that's where, looking back, when we were talking about these terms about attachment disorder, reactive attachment disorder, that's when you kind of pinpoint your self awareness. That's what you were going through in dealing with them, right?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously started with the initial separation from my birth family. And I'm not exactly sure what happened, right? But obviously, there were some traumatic events. The experience in the orphanage was very traumatic. And then, so you can only imagine, right, being separated yet again from a family who I had understood was going to be my permanent family. That was very harmful psychologically to me as a young child at that time. And yes, that is when I started to really realize, at that very young age of 7, right? I can't trust anybody. I can't depend on anybody. I can't lean on anybody. I have to take care of myself. I have to, do what I went into survival mode, essentially.
So how well it's got to be pervasive because a lot of children go through that. How intentional? Now that we have a term for it, that means there's been some intent. But how intentional is the system in recognizing the trauma that these children are going through and trying to figure out ways to deal with it, to help a child work through that?
I think there is a lot more progress now than there was back then. So attachment disorder was known and talked about. But really, I think at later stages of a child's need, right, there were behavioral things that were happening. There were challenges that the parents and the child were facing together, right? And they needed help. And that's when these terms and some of the support would come into play. But that's kind of backwards, right? Parents should know about this ahead of time. They should be educated about this even before, right, they sign up to become a part of, the care system. And back when I was having this experience, right, it was not the first, I guess, line of support that parents received. So going into my particular situation, right, these particular initial caretakers that brought me into the US didn't realize right? These were the things that I would be going through. I would have a lot of trauma. I would need many layers of support beyond just being a normal 5-year-old. And so I think now it has improved, right? I think parents are more educated than they were 30 years ago, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of providing this kind of education, awareness, and support systems in place for families and for children before the process even starts.
Yeah. So your organization, do you kind of help people deal with that trauma on both sides? You kind of advise potential parents as well as people that are alumni, as you refer to them.
I have really wonderful friends in this space that are doing that. I have my friend Ostrid, who's the founder of Adoption Mosaic. She provides those resources. I have a new friend named Isaac Etter. He's the founder of Identity. He's a transracial adoptee from the Black community that provides those resources to parents, families, and adoptees themselves. My company is really focused on kind of the layers of navigating adoption, navigating just some of the responses or behaviors that we've developed because of our trauma or experiences as foster alum or adoptees of color, and how they show up for us in the workplace and how we can navigate those in a positive and approachable way where we can support each other and elevate each other and really work to, like I said, close this opportunity gap that we're facing, because some of these things can hold us back. It can hold us back from, even simple things like asking for help or seeking out mentors or understanding like what our boundaries are, right? And so my company is really focused on providing this network of support, but also network of opportunity with these kinds of resources so we can elevate our careers and elevate our professional opportunities, both for each other, but like the broader community at large.
So you mentioned you're talking about workplace, and one of the common themes that people have been addressing, especially people of color have been addressing, have been code switching. You talk about this persona you created in your youth called Sweet Grace.
Mm-hmm.
And you describe Sweet Grace as your first act of code switching. Kind of talk about that and the importance of people recognizing that in that environment.
Yeah. When the first U.S. family relinquished me and I went into the foster care system, I was placed into a home that had a lot of kids, and they had adopted most of them. We had other foster kids who I saw come in the home and leave the home. I saw some of the adoptive kids, sent away to boarding schools, stuff like that. And so I really learned early, at 7 years old, that I need to be what I think these parents want me to be so that I can secure my place here, and that there's no threat of me being relinquished again and put in the system again and given up again. I developed what I thought was the grace that they thought they were getting, right? I was often described as the sweet, quiet, meek little Asian girl. And, I grew up in a predominantly white community and the parents were white. And so, all the Asian stereotypes come into play there too, especially for Asian women, Asian girls. And so I played that part, right? I knew that they thought they were getting this sweet person, this angel, And so I knew I needed to play that part to feel secure in my ability to stay in that family. And it's something that unfortunately a lot of foster youth, a lot of adoptees feel like they have to do when they're placed into home situations that that they've experienced, right? Placements multiple times. It's just an unfortunate reality for a lot of youth in the system.
Now, you said they had a lot of kids. At some point, I think they had at least 20 children in the house at one given time.
It was a lot. Yep. Hmm.
What kind of house was that? I mean, I was trying to envision it when I was reading about that. I was like, what kind of house did these people live in? And how could they even afford the house note or whatever, let alone trying to take care of 20 children?
Yeah, and I think it's a piece of the system that clearly was very broken at the time, right? I don't think any two parents, no matter their intention, right, and no matter um, the resources they have, even if they're super wealthy people, 20 children is just it's too much. It's too much for two people to really take on and be able to give their all and everything they need to give to every single individual child. And they may try. And again, I understand intentions can be good, but who does it impact the most, right? And it impacts the kids that are in that situation who are not getting what they need, both emotionally and whatever other resources they might not have. The house that I grew up in at that time, it was a modest home. They were not wealthy by any means. We never wanted or needed for anything, right? They provided. And you have to remember, right, that there are government stipends that are given to foster parents and adoptive parents. So, I think that was helpful in terms of us having enough clothing and food to eat and all that kind of stuff. And in some ways, I grew up fairly privileged because, right, there's many youth in my situation that don't have all their basic needs met. And I was able to go to great schools and, really be able to be educated in ways that a lot of folks in a lot of foster youth or adoptees don't get that opportunity. But at the same time, right, there was also a very real, tangible piece of just gap in resources that I needed in terms of emotional support, mental health support, even just a sense of belonging in a family, because there's so many of us, it was hard to know, right, where you belonged and how you were a real part of that family when the parents had so much on their plates and had so much demanded from them. So, yeah, I mean, it was not, it was a modest home and socioeconomic class, we were, I would say, considered working class. So, yeah, that's what that environment was like.
And so, fast forward now, you get to adulthood and you meet this person that you really, really like, but you kind of hold this person off for like 8 years before y'all decided to get married and have children. Is that how that went down?
Yeah, no, I love that you've read all the articles that I share. Yeah, no, I met this person very early in my higher educational journey. Part of that, right, because it took me 9 years to finish my bachelor's degree.
Okay.
And so part of that was really me needing to, I understood at that age that I needed to make sure that I could take care of myself. I needed to achieve the goals and aspirations that I had. Otherwise, I would never be happy in any relationship. And I think regardless, right, if you're adopted or foster care alum right? Those are realizations many, many young adults have. And I'm glad, right, that I persevered and had that persistence to accomplish those goals. But the other half of it, yes, was the needing to be able to work through and navigate my experiences of not having connection, not really having family and bonds and people that I trusted, and allowing someone into my life where they would see, right, not the sweet Grace, they would see the real Grace. And it took a long time for me to be able to feel safe, secure, and really trust, right, that this person was in the relationship for all the right reasons, which she was. And now we're happily married and have a little one. But yeah, it's quite a journey for someone with my lived experience.
And being a mom has invoked certain emotions. You kind of touched on them a little bit about, I guess, dealing with nurturing and dealing with protection. Um, that I think you are incorporating in the work that you are doing. Is that a fair statement to say?
Yeah, it definitely, parenthood definitely changes how you, I guess, re-experience your own childhood as an adoptee or foster care alum. And there's a lot of triggers that happen, but there's also a lot of healing that happens. And yeah, I mean, it is completely a part of who we are. When we become parents, that becomes a big identity for us. But our foster alum or our adoptee identity doesn't go away, right? So all of those identities are intersectional. We talked about, intersectionality a lot. I know you do too, and how that really shows up in all areas of our lives, including, right, how we show up professionally and where we choose to work, what careers we choose. All of that is impacted by all of our life experience. So yeah, it is a part of the work that I do.
So, all right. Imagine I'm still an elected official and I come to you and I say, Grace, is there a particular bill or a law that you want to see to help make adoptions, foster care, and to improve the system? What would you suggest to me?
Yeah, I think your question is good. And our elected officials have so much influence on the experience of adoption, on the experience of the foster care system for both the parents and those with lived experience as the adoptees or foster youth. And I think, one of the really big missing pieces that I hear over and over again from our community, right, is the understanding of what the actual kids that go through this, what their actual lived experience is. And I think, I'm not sure what that bill looks like, but I think we have for so long, right, our society has really centered the agencies, the institutions, those broader organizations that facilitate these adoptions or facilitate these home placements. And there's a lot of emphasis on that, right? And part of that is because there's a lot of money exchanged between those institutions and those parents, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a really big deal to our government, right, that these institutions continue to be supported and funded, et cetera, et cetera. But my question always is, well, what about the kids? what about the kids? How are you understanding what's impacting them in real time to make their experience better? Because they're the ones coming through these systems, whether good or bad experiences, that they have to live and carry that for the rest of their lives. And it shapes who they are. It also shapes who they choose to be for society. And there are a lot of us that are in the social impact space. There's so many in the nonprofit sector that want to work in government, that want to work in social work, that want to create companies to make these experiences better. So that's fantastic, right? So we need to create policies where we're thinking about what is the experience of these kids in real time in these home placements, so that we can continue to help inspire, right, these kids to want to participate in our society in these really good ways. And I think that that's a really big missing piece, is centering the lived experience of these youth. And I want that to be the very first thing institutions and families do when they start talking about adopting a child or fostering a child.
All right. So, last question, real quick. If you could travel back in time and talk to, let's say, Sweet Grace, right? What would you, not, based on what you have experienced as an adult, what you have learned, what would you tell Sweet Grace what would be the one thing you tell her to make her feel more comfortable about where she is?
Yeah, that question makes me a little emotional, to be honest. I would go back and tell Sweet Grace that she is enough. She didn't feel that she was enough for anybody. So she always had to prove herself and do more and be more and hide, right, the parts of her that she thought would not be accepted by her families. So I think if I had heard that even once growing up, that would have made such a huge difference. And so that's what I hope, like my company, the Inclusion Initiative, is really helping to change, at least for adults. If we're not hearing it as youth, I want us to hear it as adults so that we can move forward together and continue to elevate in that way. So.
All right. So I don't want this. I'm not trying to be like Oprah. I ain't trying to get you tear jerking, but I did want to ask that question because it does relate to what you do. So this is the time now where you plug how people can get in touch with you or get in touch with the Inclusion Initiative.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you can find me most easily on LinkedIn, Grace Young Foster on LinkedIn. And please connect with us at theinclusioninitiative.com. We'd love to have you. If you have lived experience, we'd love to have you in our network, in our community. If you're an ally or want to be a partner or a supporter, please get in touch with us and just help us close this opportunity gap.
Well, Grace Young Foster, I greatly appreciate you, one, being on this podcast, but two, doing this kind of work. I know it's not easy, but it is necessary because, as I was talking to another guest, it's about the humanity, right? It's about
That's
making
right.
sure that all of us as human beings reach our greatest potential. So I thank you for taking this on.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for caring and being such an important ally to our communities, Eric. Appreciate you.
Yes, ma'am. All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it's time for my next guest. And that guest is Dan Egol. Dan Egol has over 10 years of experience in the social impact sector with a focus on building cultures and systems that advance inclusion, diversity, equity, access, and social justice ideas. Dan is passionate about co-creating and executing strategies and programs that foster leadership and development and community development, as well as advancing the mission and vision of Ideas Generation, a nonprofit he co-founded to cultivate and sustain the next generation of ideas leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Dan Egol. All right, Dan Egol, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. It's nice and early here in Los Angeles, but grateful to be here.
Yes, and I'm glad that you are up and about early, so we can do this interview. But I greatly appreciate you coming on, and I want to do what I normally do at the beginning of interviews is that I give the person a quote, right? And it's either something that they have said, something that they have written, or something relating to the work or the topic we're going to discuss. So this is your quote. Intersectionality has given many advocates a way to frame their circumstances and to fight for their visibility and inclusion. What does that quote mean to you?
For me, that quote is an important framing of how we approach the work of honoring people's stories, their experiences, and co-creating cultures and organizations where those stories and experiences can really thrive. I think the American story has been one where there have been many experiences that have not seen the light of day, but should have not been given the due respect that they deserve. And intersectionality, the framework from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, gives us a way to understand the nuance and complexity of who we are and to shed light on some of the lesser visible things that are important to us as human beings.
So, Dan, talk to me about Ideas Generation. What is it, and what motivated you to help start it?
Sure. So Ideas Generation is a nonprofit that works in the leadership and workforce development space, specifically for millennial and Gen Z folks that are committed to advancing ideas, which is our acronym for inclusion, diversity, equity, access, and social justice. And the premise of the organization is that our communities, our organizations, our schools, our religious institutions need these values to ensure that everyone can be their best selves and to also address some of the historical injustices that communities have faced. And in an organization or a workplace or just a society where we have 5 generations currently interacting, our goal is to try and figure out how do we honor the legacy of those who have come before us and advance issues around ideas and make sure that this work remains relevant, salient, and impactful for generations to come. I come to this work alongside 2 incredible folks, Mignon Tolan and Hannah Mack. The 3 of us were colleagues at an organization called Cook Ross, which has recently been rebranded as Be Equitable under the leadership of Michael Leslie Amilcar. And the organization was a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm, or DEI firm. And it was my first job out of college. I did not have language for DEI, or as I call it now, ideas, which is DEI plus access and social justice. But my life story had, I think, always put me on a path to want to explore and understand those values and principles in action to make sure that they weren't just applicable to me or others, but really to everyone. And Mignon, this was really her idea as one of the rising leaders in our space and someone who would regularly be the youngest person in the room in our organization, whether it was with client organizations or in conferences. And we would go to these spaces and look out and see amazing folks who had done really important work. We wouldn't be here without them. However, we didn't see particularly millennials and Gen Zers in the formal DEI space, which was odd to us given that we knew that our generational peers were really passionate about this work. And part of the reason we saw was just that the folks who had been trailblazers and leaders in this space, in whatever professional or personal context they might find themselves, were so busy doing the work that they didn't have the capacity to really think about what would a formal onboarding process look like to bring on that next generation of change leaders. And so Ideas Generation is our attempt to try and put some resources and structure behind those efforts to partner across generations and make sure that everyone can really thrive.
You know, it's really, really cool how people are creative with acronyms, right? So, and when I saw that and saw the genesis of it, I was like, that's pretty neat. So we're talking about inclusion, diversity, equity, access, and social justice. Why did you feel that the access and social justice needed to be incorporated in the title and in the work?
It's an important question, especially given how the DEI field has come under much more public scrutiny and conversation over the last few years. And I think part of the challenge that's underlying that controversy is a lack of understanding of what is the actual substance of this work, why does it exist, what are people trying to accomplish with it. And I don't necessarily think we're doing ourselves as a field any favors by having a bunch of different terminology to describe the work, because it creates confusion. So recognizing that, we were very intentional about using ideas as our framework for a few reasons. First, we wanted to acknowledge that in a lot of the more traditional DEI conversations, especially because they've come out of our nation's history and inability to, I think, really reconcile with our racial past and present, many of the conversations around DEI are anchored in questions of racial justice, as they should be. However, we also felt like, given the world that we live in now, given the pandemic, given the rise of technology, and also to acknowledge the experience of folks with disabilities and neurodiversity, that access was a really important part of the conversation that was often being overlooked. And when we're thinking about intersectionality, that for us felt really important because folks with disability and experiences of neurodiversity are actually the largest minority group in the world. And so for us, access was both an intentional inclusion of that experience as important in our work, but it also meant expanding what we meant by access to really think about, for example, you and I are having this conversation in different parts of the country. So we have access to technology that is facilitating our ability to connect. We're having this conversation in English. So the assumption is that this is the best language for us to be using to communicate, where it may not be the case for everyone that is the chosen mode of communication. And so for us, access helps us understand the barriers to participation, the cultural barriers that may prevent people from being able to do their best work, to engage fully, to have meaningful relationships, and to also acknowledge the history of disability and neurodiversity in our society. With social justice, this came out because for us, a lot of the diversity work that we've seen done in organizations has sort of been co-opted by the need for a business case, and in a capitalist system has been couched as an economic driver of growth. And that has in some cases been the only avenue to make sure that this work could take place. And in those contexts, I think that it's better to have that as an entryway rather than nothing. However, for me and for my colleagues, this work is not about putting more money in the bottom line of organizations. If that is a byproduct of good and meaningful work that advances racial equity, disability justice, and everything else that falls under this umbrella, then that's wonderful. But for us, this is about building a better society for everyone and making sure that regardless of your identity, regardless of the community you were born in, regardless of your hopes for yourselves, everyone has an equitable opportunity to reach their full potential. And for us, social justice is about that never-ending commitment, recognizing historical and systemic injustices and prioritizing addressing those first.
So one of the concerns I had when 2020, the summer of 2020 happened, and that all these corporations started trying to tap into people like you and organizations like Ideas Generation to help them improve their face. And you kind of addressed that in the answer when you're talking about social justice, because their objective was to increase their bottom line by saying, hey, black folks, we're not racist. You know what I'm saying? Do business with us. But now we see that there's a push to kick out or de-emphasize DEI.
Mm-hmm.
What is your take on that? Are you seeing the same thing? Are you encountering that? Or well, yeah, just give me your opinion about what you see happening now, basically 4 years later.
Mm-hmm. So the pushback that I see now and a lot of the current conversations around the state of DEI, I look at in the larger trajectory of social justice and social change movements. There are always ebbs and flows of support and resistance. And so while I'm concerned by what feels like a regression to we were committed, but perhaps only so much, and now that we're concerned about the impact or concerned about progress or we're not feeling immediate results, we're going to renege on our public commitments. It's certainly concerning, but it's also not the full story. And so what I mean by that is that you've seen many organizations, both in the corporate world, government agencies, nonprofits, that really are doubling down on their commitments, even if they have, in this moment of increased scrutiny and pressure, to have pivot and reformulate how they're thinking about the work. Part of the biggest challenge that I've seen, and is something that I continue to perhaps harp on, is that there isn't consensus about what this work actually is, neither from organizations that are taking it on institutionally, nor from external practitioners or even internal leaders who are charged with trying to affect these kinds of changes. Are we, when we talk about DEI, discussing particular interventions or programs within organizations that are meant to serve particular populations? So for example, are we doing organizational culture assessments? Are we coaching leaders? Are we talking about education? Are we talking about building strategies that incorporate these values into the trajectory of an organization or community? Are we using this as a lens to review policies, procedures, programs, and therefore doing this as a review to think about how do these values and principles show up in our work in the world? And to me, I think all of those things are true and part of the equation. But until we as sort of an emerging and developing field can have some consensus about what this work is and what it isn't, and perhaps some of the guiding principles that undergird it, we're always going to be facing these external challenges where people are concerned about what this is because there's fear in the confusion. It's an unknown. And until people are really clear about what this work is, why it's necessary, why it's largely being housed in your workplace, and is that the best venue for us to be discussing and trying to make change around these topics, there I think will always be this push and pull. And so one of the things that I've been really encouraged by is that the organizations we tend to work with on the whole are smaller nonprofits, because our approach to this work is whole systems, so that we're looking at all of those dynamics. And in order for us to be able to engage with the internal, the external, and all parts of an organization, given the size of our small but mighty team, we need to actually partner with smaller systems, because we wouldn't be well prepared to serve a Pepsi or Bank of America. They're just too large given the time and resource intensive approach that we take. But with the organizations we do have the privilege of working with, they're much more willing to engage in things that I think will actually have longer term impact. So for example, one of the keys to our approach that I think would actually help address some of the resistance and concern that people have at a national level about what this work is what we call container building. So in the summer of 2020, the nation watched the horrific police murder of George Floyd. And many organizations for the first time were having this realization that, oh my goodness, we have to reckon with our racial past and present. And immediately said, well, now we need to discuss systemic racism. And we absolutely do. There is no question that this nation needs to have that conversation. But for me, sitting watching this conversation unfold, if this is the realization you're having for the first time as an institution in 2020, I'm putting all my money on the bet that you're not ready to have that conversation in a way that will actually be meaningful, productive, lead to change, and not actually heighten resistance. And the reason why I don't think most organizations are ready is because they haven't invested over the long haul in building the relationships, the skills, the trust, and the ability to have those conversations so that they can actually lead to the outcome that they say they want. And so the organizations we work with have all agreed to take on a much longer term process of container building, which for us is a series of facilitated exercises and engagements that the whole organization undertakes that are sort of like if you played a sport, it's like preseason for DEI. You know, I played soccer as a kid growing up and had the privilege of participating in organized sports. And I was never allowed to just walk on the field and play. you had summer conditioning, you had tryouts, you had preseason, you had practice every day, and only then could the team then go out and play in a match. But with the DEI work, it seems like most folks are comfortable saying, okay, we've done nothing to build trust. We've done nothing to acknowledge past challenges. But today we're going to talk about white supremacy, which is, again, a very important topic, but one that we have not actually prepared people to have productively. So I'll end this little ramble by saying that our container building approach is about how do we build relationships in an organization? How do we create shared understanding so that when I use the term inclusion and you, Eric, use the term inclusion, we're actually having a conversation rooted in shared understanding? How are we beginning to build skills to foster trust and repair it, knowing that human beings we're flawed, we make mistakes, no one's perfect, myself definitely included. But in this work that is so interpersonally important, how do we build the skills when you make a mistake to be able to give another person grace in order to repair it, but also to acknowledge that trust and harm might have been broken, or trust has been broken and harm has been done, and we need to actually have skills to repair it. So I recognize this is a bit of a longer answer, but for me, I see glimmers of hope when organizations are willing to put in that investment, because even though they may not see the direct benefits of, oh, we didn't have that conversation around systemic racism in the first few months of working together, this prep work actually makes that conversation more possible, more impactful, and more sustainable when we get there.
Well, anytime you give an answer and you use a sports analogy, you're in my good graces. I love sports analogies. Talk to me about the Roddenberry Fellowship and what winning one has done for you and your work.
Mm-hmm. It's honestly been life-changing. The Roddenberry Fellowship has been more than words can possibly express. And I would say, as someone who's actually never seen Star Trek, and they know this, you don't actually have to be a Star Trek fan to apply for this opportunity. It's just, I feel like a superhero who could have been on that show, not because I'm some incredible human being, but just because of the amazing caliber of human beings that are part of this program. So for those that are not familiar with it, the Roddenberry Foundation runs a fellowship program for social justice leaders who are tackling lots of different kinds of topics, but are all working to address building a more inclusive and equitable society. And it's actually the reason why I'm here in Los Angeles is because they have twice annual convenings with the Roddenberry community. And that community includes the folks who work at the foundation, the current class of fellows, and those who have been alums of the program. And Ideas Generation is a nonprofit that is still trying to figure out how best to be resourced through philanthropic channels, whether that be individual giving, institutional support, corporate sponsorship, because we do have this opportunity to earn revenue through our partnerships with our clients. And Roddenberry was the first national foundation that said, we're going to put a stake in your success, to believe in that what you're doing is important, and that we see a role of philanthropy in supporting this mission to build a sustainable pipeline of leaders advancing ideas. And so the recognition has been incredibly validating, because we've had dozens of conversations with foundations that have not led to the result of funding. And it was also, I think, on a personal level, the acknowledgement that they wanted to invest in me as well has been both humbling, and in a line of work where ideas is bigger than I am, the work is not about me, and I'm also a human being who gets exhausted, gets frustrated, has dreams, has goals, to have just a moment carved out where I can actually be a little bit selfish in service of the mission, to say, hey, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity and lean into the discomfort of having a more public profile as a result of it, has been really good practice. And like I said, I feel like I'm on a team of superheroes with my Roddenberry cohort members and being part of this community. And it's given me a lot of hope in a time that has felt very dark and tumultuous, just to see that there's so many incredible people across the nation doing really meaningful and really important work. And to have this vibrant network of connections to them definitely makes me feel less isolated when the going gets tough in our work.
All right. So Dan, you caught my attention with this piece you wrote for LinkedIn. People are not their governments, a call for humanity. What prompted you to write this piece?
So on October 7th, the world witnessed some horrific attacks in the nation of Israel in the Middle East. And I was deeply concerned both by the immediate violence of what took place that day, but also very concerned about the rhetoric that was surrounding it, because I could foresee what was going to come as a result of what happened, which is now, as we've seen, 4 or 5 months of catastrophic war in Gaza and, the loss of life and security and freedom for the Palestinian people. And just, I was concerned that most folks would not have the context or understanding of what has been going on there, not just since October 7th, but for generations. And as someone who is an Israeli citizen, although I've never lived there, I received my citizenship through birthright and family. I understand how the Netanyahu government operates and how the Israeli government operates, and have also seen the rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia all over the world, and felt like, given the work that we do and given the way that I saw this conversation being treated within the DEI field, it felt important to me that we actually honor the principles that supposedly guide our work in also addressing the humanity of people on all sides of the issue, because I was concerned that I was hearing from folks who are supportive of the state of Israel a lot of labeling that felt inaccurate and incomplete of folks on the other side, and similarly a conflation of Israelis, Jewish people, Zionists, and recognizing that people are more than just the political labels that are attached to them, and in particular those labels that you don't get to choose because of the government that purports to represent you, even if you didn't vote for that government, if you do not choose that government. Like, I didn't choose where I was born, I didn't choose my ethnicity or where my family roots are, and yet I was seeing people make claims about me and about others like me without knowing me. And I know that that's an experience that is not just unique to Jewish folks, to Israeli folks. It is certainly happening for folks that are Palestinian or Arab or Muslim, and for Black folks. I mean, any marginalized group, this is one of the key features of marginalization, is that you are a representative of your group before an individual, and you lose your individuality based on those assumptions about what your label means. And so I didn't want it to be the case that we would just forget the humanity of everyone when the death toll started to rise in the response to the October 7th attack, that we would forget the horrors of what happened to people in their homes. And so for me, I certainly don't have the answers, but I wanted to make sure that we were reminding ourselves of our own humanity, because to the degree that we use labels to describe people, it felt like, to me, I and others were distancing ourselves from our own humanity, which was what I was afraid that would be lost. And I also was afraid of what people would respond to when I wrote that on LinkedIn, because I'm not someone who typically writes very publicly. And I know that people are going to be in a state of response that is deeply in pain, and reasonably so. I mean, people's lives are being lost, their homes are being lost, their sense of security and safety is being completely compromised. And so it's not without justification, but I didn't want the us and them dynamic to continue to be exacerbated without understanding the nuance of human experience and the importance of remembering that you can't achieve, for me, you can't achieve justice for anyone by oppressing anyone else. And that's true on all sides. And I didn't want that to be lost.
I wrote something long time ago. I think I might have still been an elected official, or maybe right after, I was done running for office, when, talking about labels and how I disdain them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have kind of surrendered my point because I can't change human behavior. I have to learn how to adapt to the labels that are stuck to me. But the most important thing, and the reason why I really was moved to the point where I wanted to reach out to you, was the focus on the humanity piece. I think when we do this kind of work, whether it's in the nonprofit sector or in government or, just straight up street activism, right? We get caught up in the issue, and we get caught up in whoever we view the opposition is. And we forget the fact that all of us are human beings. And so to me, I think the key is focusing on the humanity part. And I think that that nut is tougher to crack with certain individuals than it is with, the masses, but it's still something that we have to probe into in order to get resolution. How does it, does that sound far off to think like that?
Not at all. I mean, it's interesting because I get concerned when people hear that call for humanity, and then we get into the Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter conversation, because the world should be one where all lives matter. However, the reason why a movement like Black Lives Matter exists because they have not been treated, the Black community has not been treated historically or currently as if their lives matter as well. And so I don't mean for the calls for humanity to sound overly kumbaya and we're all just going to hold hands and everything will be fine and we will erase the very real differences and discrepancies in experience, in marginalization, in systems of oppression that people have to navigate in different ways because of the labels that are applied to them, often through no fault or through no merit of their own. And at the same time, I think the world of DEI and the world ideas generation wants to live in is where we can value and honor the aspects of who we are, but that they not be the determining factor of outcomes or treatment or experience. And so to your point, for me, humanity is at the center of everything we do. This work has to have soul. That's why social justice is such an important part of our work, because at the end of the day, your organization can make a lot of money doing things that are really harmful to people on the planet. Policies can do the same. And so for us, humanity is everything, because if we don't have each other, then what are we doing?
Exactly. As you see this conflict continue, in my unique position, podcasting, I've had the privilege of talking to people who have opinions on both sides so far. What are your thoughts right now? Do you feel that we're fading away from that hope of seeing everybody as human, or do you see some progress coming?
I see both at both the individual and sort of a larger level. And what I mean by that is, in response to what I wrote on LinkedIn, there were definitely a few outspoken individuals who were not happy about what I had written and expressed so pretty clearly. And what was sad to me about that was, I wasn't anticipating that everyone was going to love what I wrote. That would be completely naive. But sad because their comments were made in the absence of any relationship with me. They never reached out personally. They never asked any clarifying questions. They never did anything to say, hey, I'd like to understand more of what you meant. It was actually just more labels of these are all the reasons why what you wrote was wrong, why you are vile, why we thought we'd gotten rid of all the bad ones, in quote, already. And so that was really disheartening, because I would have loved to have seen from those folks who are all members of the DEI field the opportunity to use inquiry, to use compassion, to use generosity. And maybe I didn't earn the trust or the opportunity to expect that of them. And so I'm willing to own that as well. But that be the gut reaction was upsetting. But at the same time, I also received a lot of private messages from folks who are Palestinian, who are Arab American, or Arabs in the diaspora, who expressed gratitude for what I wrote. And so even though I understood why they didn't also share that gratitude publicly, I was still encouraged and appreciative of that outreach. And I see similar conversations happening in a national or international level that are both giving me hope and also putting me on my heels a little bit. And what's putting me on my heels is that I don't actually think that we're having the right conversations about how to address what's going on. And part of the reason is that we're using labels, as we talked about earlier, but they're not necessarily the right ones. And for me, one of the things that's sort of being missed is the role of authoritarianism, and fascism that is also plaguing Israel and our own nation, by the way. So the question is not just an issue of Judaism and Islam or religion or ethnic identity, but also the way that we orient towards power and systems of power that has been a trend across the world, whether it's in Latin America, Europe, Eastern Asia. It's not unique to this experience, but I think until we're ready to have a conversation around why does the Israeli government have a policy the way it does? Why is it concentrating power in the way it has? Why is Hamas seen as a viable leadership structure for the people of Gaza, we're missing a huge opportunity to come up with solutions that can actually create lasting peace for everyone. And I don't believe that fascism or authoritarianism is the right way to go, because it will squash all of the work that Ideas Generation is doing, which comes on the shoulders of countless social change leaders who are trying very hard to make sure that people have a voice, that we have opportunities for discussion. It doesn't mean we have to agree on everything, but to the degree that the end goal is just to maintain power, we'll always be a step behind.
All right, so this is the part of the show where you make your plug. So how can people get in touch with you? How can people get in touch with Ideas Generation? Go ahead and make your pitch.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that opportunity, Eric. For me, our team often jokes that even though we're an organization based on next generation leadership, I am the worst millennial when it comes to social media and the ability to sort of promote. So this definitely speaks to a growth edge for me. But folks are more than welcome to get in touch with us through www.ideasgeneration.org. We host a public Slack channel, so it's a platform for folks to connect all over the world who are passionate about advancing ideas in their schools, in their families, in their workplaces. And so we'd love to have folks join us, and that's completely free. We're also always having programs, both of which are in person and virtual and hybrid. So we're trying to make sure that the leadership development and community building programs that we offer are available to folks regardless of location and geography. And so we'll have more programs coming up later this year, which folks can learn about more on our website. We can also be followed on LinkedIn. You can look for us there. We're also at Ideas Generation on Instagram, and would love to connect with folks who are interested, curious, want to learn more. And if anyone's willing to make a donation, we are a 501c3 tax-free nonprofit. So that would be great too, to support our efforts.
Well, Dan, Egol, it's been an honor to talk with you, to connect with you and have you come on the podcast. The sincerity and the commitment that I saw in your writing, now I've got to listen to it firsthand, and I wish you much success in doing the heavy lifting that you've chosen to do. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Eric, for both the acknowledgement and the opportunity. It's been a pleasure, and I'm grateful that this is the opportunity I have in life.
All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So now, my final guest, and this is somebody from my old stomping grounds in Jackson, Mississippi, a friend of mine, and his name is Jerry Mitchell. Stories of investigative reporter Jerry Mitchell have helped put 4 Klansmen and a serial killer behind bars. His stories have also helped free 2 people from death row, expose injustices and corruption, prompting investigations and reforms, as well as the firings of boards and officials. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist, a longtime member of the Investigative Reporters and Editors, and a winner of more than 30 other national awards, including a $500,000 MacArthur Genius Grant. His memoir for Simon & Schuster, Race Against Time, details how some of the nation's most notorious murders came to be punished decades later. The New York Times made it an editor's pick, and NPR selected it as a best book of the year. After working for 3 decades for the statewide Clarion Ledger, Mitchell left in 2019 and founded the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting, a nonprofit that exposes injustices and raises up the next generation of investigative reporters. The stories of MCIR have already led to 2 separate Justice Department investigations. Since summer of 2022, the nonprofit, now a part of Mississippi Today, has been working with the New York Times on a series that has exposed allegations of how Mississippi sheriffs and their deputies have carried out horrific crimes, including torturing suspects and the beatings and sexual abuse of those behind bars. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Jerry Mitchell. All right, Jerry Mitchell. How you doing, my friend? You doing good?
I'm doing well, Eric.
Long time
Thanks for
no
having me.
see. Long time no
Yeah,
see.
it's been a while.
You done got a little grayer, and I done lost all mine. So
Happens, doesn't it?
yes, it does. Yeah, but it's really good to see you, man. Um I know you've been still doing a lot, even though you're not with the main newspaper anymore.
Yeah, I'm with
And
Mississippi Today now, so yeah.
yeah, and so I want to highlight some of the work that you're doing with
Thank
that.
you.
It's really kind of the way I want to do this interview with you is just to kind of let people know a little bit about who you are.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
I think you have a pretty good social media profile, but you know a lot of good things that come out of Mississippi kind of stay a secret for folks. And you're one of the great things that have happened in Mississippi. So I just wanted to give you this opportunity on my show to kind of expand that. And it's good to have somebody that kind of put me on the front page a couple of times with their reporting. You know what I'm
There you go.
saying? kind of return the favor. But seriously though, normally what I try to do with these interviews is I start off with a quote, and it's either something the person may have written, something they may have said, or relates to the work that they're doing. So your quote is, "Nothing is quite so dangerous as a religious fanatic who thinks he's doing the Lord's will." How do you respond to that quote?
Yeah, that was what I had a Klansman tell me, or a former Klansman tell me when I was hanging out with him. Yeah, that was Delmar Dennis, who was a Klansman turned FBI informant. And yeah, that was wild. I was talking to him. He lived near Gallenberg, and so which is not terribly far from where Byron D. LeBeckwith was living, in near Chattanooga. Um, and of course, had already visited him and heard him spout his racism and everything. And then to have basically Delmar was saying, Beckwith might kill me, and that's what he was talking about. And yeah, it's a line that's gotten quoted from my book now, Race Against Time, and it's still very true. It's amazing how sometimes truth seems to be more truer over time, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does, especially in this day and age. So,
Yeah.
what really got you interested in reporting, and what moment led you to do the investigative reporting that you've become famous for?
I mean, pretty simple. What got me into investigative reporting? What got me into journalism was I like to write. It's really that simple. But for whatever reason, I always gravitated to investigative reporting. And um, so I was working at this little small paper in East Texas. And this guy was an old state house reporter from Oklahoma, burned out, smoking, several packs of Marlboros a day. This is back when newsrooms weren't, there's no such thing as non-smoking newsrooms. And so he's puffing on his Marlboros and is like, uh, asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, well, I've thought about, investigative reporting. And he was like, have you ever read All the President's Men? I said, no, I've seen the movie. He says, read the book and study how they use attribution. I'm like, okay. And I did exactly what he said. And it was like it opened opened my eyes to how investigative reporting could be done. And from that point forward, I really started doing it. I just started, use that book as a primer and just started doing it.
Well, I mean, Woodward and Bernstein are pretty good people to learn from.
Yeah, good people to imitate.
Yeah.
So I learned from them and kind of went from there.
Okay.
I had no course in investigative reporting, none, zero. I just began doing it, trial and error for sure. And then I got to Mississippi. I started working at the Clarion Ledger, the statewide newspaper, in '86 is when I started working there, and worked there for over 30 years. But I was a young reporter there, and in January of 1989, I was basically assigned to cover the the press premiere of the movie Mississippi Burning, which, I grew up in East Texas. I didn't grow up in Mississippi, so I knew none of, or very little, I'll put it that way, of kind of all the incredible violence, here in Mississippi. Mississippi was ground zero for obviously the civil rights movement in this country. And so I just didn't know any of the background. So I was assigned to cover this movie, which was really a fictional takeoff. It's not really, it's not like a quote unquote true story. It's more like fictional, and it's got pieces of fact in it. And so I went to the movie and happened to go there with two FBI agents who, basically investigate that case, and sat by one of them. And that began my journey. I knew nothing of it, but I was shocked. It was, of course, based on the real life Klan killings of those three civil rights workers: James Chaney, African American from Meridian, and then Mickey Schwerner and Andy Goodman, who were both from New York City and had come to Mississippi to be part of the movement. And so the Klan killed all three of them, executed them, and buried their bodies 15 feet down in an earthen dam. Really a miracle their bodies were ever found. They weren't found until, 44 days later. And that's a whole long story of all that. But anyway, long story short, there were more than 20 Klansmen involved in that triple murder, and nobody ever been prosecuted for murder. And that just kind of blew my mind because, I covered courts. It's like I cover murder trials all the time. I was like, what? Nobody ever prosecuted for murder, And so that was what shocked me. And, I'm hearing from these FBI agents what really happened, as opposed to maybe what the film had, or maybe pieces of fact that were in the film, and they were kind of telling me what really happened. And so then a month later, is when I got my first leak of the Sovereignty Commission record, Mississippi Sovereignty Commission records. And that began my journey down into that world, which then led me to, I don't know if you're like me, but if someone tells me I can't have something, I want it like a million times worse.
Exactly.
So I began, after the initial leak, I began to develop sources who basically began to leak me files. And what they show is, at the same time, the state of Mississippi was prosecuting Byron D. Levesque for the murder of Medgar Evers in Jackson. This other arm of the state, the Sovereignty Commission, was secretly assisting the defense trying to get back with acquitted. And nobody knew that. And so my story ran in the Clarion Ledger October 1st of 1989. And that kind of began that journey of looking into these civil rights cold cases. Yeah.
So one of my memories about you covering the eventual convictions of people that were involved in the Philadelphia killings was it was on the front page of the Clarion Ledger. It was a 3-picture panel, and it was this guy who showed up, and he showed up to court in a wheelchair and an oxygen tent and all that tank on him and all that.
That was the Vernon Damer case. Yeah.
Oh, that was Vernon Damer. Okay. And
Vernon Damer case.
yeah,
Yeah, I can tell you that story if you want to hear the story.
yeah. Tell me about the story about that
So
guy with the oxygen tank. That
yeah,
was one of the
so this
best
is
ones.
a Vernon Damer case. This is a Vernon Damer case. Um, so Vernon Damer basically died, defending his family from a Klan attack down in Hattiesburg, and so uh, anyway, I began writing about that case after after Byron D. LeBeck got indicted in the Medgar Evers case, and I had gone and interviewed him, and he got indicted. Then I started looking at other cases, and one of them was the Vernon Damer case, and so I started writing about it. And the eventually I mean, all these things we're talking like years, not not months, but years. Years later, Sam Bowers is finally charged in the case. Now, Sam Bowers was the head of the White Knights of the KKK in Mississippi, responsible for at least 10 killings. He ordered the killings of the 3 civil rights workers. He ordered the attack on Vernon Damer and his family. And so he'd been tried but never been convicted in that case. And so fast forward now, this is now 1998, May of 1998. Sam Bowers is arrested along with his right-hand guy, whose name was Devers Nix. And when the family brought Devers Nix in, it was like the most pitiful sight you've ever seen. They like wheeled him up, like you're talking about, with the wheelchair in front of the judge, and had the oxygen, the green oxygen tank and everything. I mean, like wheeling him up in front of the judge, and he's like, I can't take more than a couple steps without needing oxygen, Judge. And Judge was like, well, I normally don't do this, but I'm going to let you out without bond. So a dozen days later, this is like a reporter's dream. We catch him playing golf. So that's exactly the pictures you're describing is exactly correct. We had the pictures of him being brought in the wheelchair, and the very next frame was him playing golf. So he got arrested, Yeah, he loved me. So
Yeah, because
anyway.
I think it was the Attorney General Moore. He said, well, if he's well
Yeah,
enough to play golf, Your Honor, I think he's well enough to sit in jail.
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
was one of.
Mike Moore's office was involved with that case, and everybody involved in that case did a good job. It was Bob Helfrich was the main prosecutor, and then the Attorney General's office helped investigate it, and assisted. Lee Martin was the lawyer that assisted, and Mike was there for some of the time.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, it was an interesting time. Which do you credit the timing, your timing coming in, and doing those stories for the success that you were able to have, or if not the timing, what do you credit your success in getting all these? Reporting about all these high profile cases, because all these cases, like you said, all this stuff happened in the 60s. And
yeah. I mean, I am a person of faith, and I believe God's hand was involved in this. I mean, the thing that with almost every one of these cases we could talk about are the incredible odds against these cases ever being prosecuted. I mean, at the time, for example, the Medgar Evers case, so let's take that for example. At the time when I started looking at that case, I mean, there was nothing in the court files of any value. There was no court transcript, nothing. There was no murder weapon. There was, no evidence. But Myrlie Evers, the widow of Medgar Evers, believed and she prayed, and some amazing things happened. A couple of months later, Jackson police are cleaning out a closet and had to find a box containing the crime scene photographs of the killing of Medgar Evers, including the fingerprint of Byron D. LeBeck was lifted from the murder weapon. And a few months after that, Myrlie Evers shared with me her copy of the court transcript she'd saved in a safety deposit box. And a few months after that, the prosecutor found the murder weapon in his father-in-law's closet. So, which sounds like I'm making it up. It really happened. And yeah, so all these impossible odds were overcome. So I as a person of faith, I just believe God's hands have been involved in it. I really do.
Yeah.
But timing was important. I would absolutely say that, because obviously they tried to prosecute some of these cases at the time, like Byron D. Beckwith, and he walked away.
Yeah.
All white, all male jury, back then, would not let any black Mississippians serve on juries.
Right. And the DA at the time, Bill Waller, he ended up being governor a few years later.
Yeah.
Which I always thought was an amazing feat, considering that he went after this guy, and then he got rewarded and got elected statewide. I thought that was interesting.
Kind of interesting. It's like the contrast, if you think about it historically, was the Emmett Till case. So in the Emmett Till case, the killers were acquitted and walked away, right? And so they couldn't be tried again ever for murder. Well, in this case, the jury deadlocked. In other words, they did not. Therefore, Beckwith could be tried again. And if that jury had, like, if Bill Waller hadn't done a good job, or if it had been just a show kind of deal, then Beckwith would have walked and couldn't have ever been tried again for murder. So I think Waller, and almost everybody from that time who saw the trial thought he did a good job.
Yeah. So talk to me about what's the purpose for the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting? Why did you feel you needed to start that?
Well, Mississippi needs more investigative reporting, not less. So I felt very strongly about that, and feel even more strongly today about it. I just, there's just such a need, where these news deserts aren't getting smaller, they're getting bigger. And these small family newspapers in communities around the state, even if they're still operating, some have closed down, they don't have the staff to go investigate, what their sheriff is really doing, that kind of thing. Plus, they have such a relationship with the sheriff that might be problematic for them. You know what I mean? Suddenly they start investigating the sheriff. Well, he's not going to talk to him anymore, or whatever. And so I feel like that's where we come in, and we're able to go in and do stories that they don't have the staff or the time or money to do. So that's like this past year, we've been investigating sheriffs in Mississippi. And actually, it all arose, we started doing this in summer of 2022. We began investigating sheriffs, not because we set out to investigate sheriffs, but because we were investigating what appeared to be a wrongful conviction of this black woman, this black mother of four, who's in prison for life for what was for basically a murder that didn't happen. And which sounds like, what? But it's true. It was apparently a suicide from all indications. And the original pathologist has now reversed himself. So everything points to it being a suicide, including the fact there was a suicide note. So, but this woman is in prison for life. So we started looking into that case, and that case is what led us to the sheriff, and the fact that he was allegedly taking women out of the jail and having sex with them, etc. And that then led us to another county to start to. We heard other things about that other county. Oh, wait, this is going on over there too. Oh, okay. So now all of a sudden we're looking at multiple counties, and then of course the latest reporting, the most, you know, in terms of publicity, story was the Goon Squad,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, Brian Howie and Nate Rosenfield and Alyssa Daly did that reporting with me. And then the Goon Squad reporting was done by Brian Howie and Nate Rosenfield, and they just did a terrific job. They spent about 6 months. And the Goon Squad, for those who maybe don't know what the Goon Squad was kind of this unit that the Rankin County Sheriff's Department had. It was a shift, late shift, and they called themselves the Goon Squad. And so what they were, they went out. They had these two black men. They heard about, literally raided the house. Did not have, wasn't a warrant. I mean, none of that. Went in, took out the cameras too. I mean, just everything they did. It was just essentially an illegal operation. And they raided. They tortured these two young black men. They used a sex toy on them. Put a gun in one of their mouths. It was kind of a Russian roulette thing, you know what I mean? Like, he emptied the chamber, put the gun in the mouth, click, and then did it again, and presumably didn't realize it didn't empty the chamber, put the gun in the mouth. This time the gun fired, and it's a miracle the guy survived. I mean, it blew off, tore through his tongue and his jaw and everything, and could have easily killed him. And these guys, of course, what do these guys do? They plant drugs. Plant drugs. They've got a gun they're going to drop. But they decide, oh no, we can use this gun they've got and set it up and make it look like they did this. And so these guys all plead guilty, have already pleaded guilty to state and federal charges, but it pretty much got written off. The sheriff had a press conference that says, "Oh, I had no idea, this happened," and it got written off by a number of people as kind of a rogue thing, one-off. And what Brian and Nate did in their reporting was show a pattern of this for at least 20 years. So this is not just a one-time deal.
So these guys that got caught, they were just the latest iteration of this Goon Squad.
You got it. And one of the guys, Brett McAlpin, who's kind of the head of the Goon Squad, he'd been in the Rankin County Sheriff's Office for over 20 years. So, and we Brian and Nate found cases involving him way back, 20, like I said, 20 years. So that's why I think our work is so valuable. There was somebody, we had a conference thing, Atlantic Magazine sponsored with Mississippi Today, and we were there and asked to speak. And we've been working directly with the New York Times on this whole series, by the way. And Dean Baquette has been great. And Dean is originally from New Orleans. A longtime executive editor for the New York Times, but now has shifted into this role of working with local journalism because he feels strongly about it. And so we ended up working with him, and it was great. Been a great experience. And so anyway, we were at this conference talking about these stories, and a woman from Rankin County got up and said, "Thank you." White woman from Rankin County said, "Thank you, because, if it weren't for your reporting, we wouldn't know this." And same thing with our reporting on those other sheriffs I mentioned. There was a local paper that wrote an editorial and thanked us. It said, we don't have the time or money to do this. So I just think that's why what we're doing. I think it's so important because people need to know. People need to know. They pay taxpayers pay their money. They should know, what their sheriffs are doing. And there's almost, the thing that's kind of interesting to me, we live in this democracy, right, where we have these checks and balances. You've got the executive branch, you've got the legislative branch, you've got the judicial branch. And so we created on purpose because we didn't want a king, right?
Right.
We created these checks and balances so nobody would have such incredible power. Well, the sheriff doesn't come from democracy. He comes from medieval times.
Right.
We kind of reached over into medieval times and borrowed the sheriff and go, okay, you're over law enforcement in this particular county, but there are no checks and balances practically. I mean, there's nobody who has any power over the sheriff. There in Mississippi, there's not. We don't even inspect jails anymore. I mean, that's the staggering thing.
Well, Jerry, in the Constitution, the only person that could arrest the sheriff was the coroner.
Coroner, yeah, the coroner. Yeah.
And that was definitely a throwback from the Wild West days, I guess. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, that's Robin Hood. Everybody remembers Robin Hood, and
Yeah.
In those days, so that's what you're talking about. I mean, you're talking that far back,
Yeah.
The sheriff of Nottingham. Everybody remembers.
Yeah, yeah. So, in light of you talking about people coming up to thank you, what was the most satisfying story for you that you worked on?
Most satisfying. That's fascinating. This is one of the things that happened that I don't know if satisfying the right word, but at least to me it's close to this. Because it's a better, at least for me, I've won some awards, which is nice, but the biggest reward has been getting to know these families, because I think that's what it's about. It's not about me, it's about justice. And you have to have truth before you can get justice, right?
Right.
And that's the role that we play. And so when Vernon Dahmer was killed by the Klan, his oldest son, Vernon Jr., basically had to take charge. And, had to find a place for the family to live. Now their house had been, basically they burned the house and, everything, it was horrible. And so I had to find a place for them to live, financial support, all those things that he had to kind of plan the funeral. I mean, all that kind of stuff. He had to come in. And he was an Air Force guy. So he was coming in from the military. In fact, six of Vernon Dahmer's 7 sons served a total of 78 years in the armed forces of the States. And so he came back and he told me there was no time to cry, right? He didn't have time to cry. And when the verdict came in and Sam Bowers was found guilty, here's this old Air Force guy, just his face in his hands, weeping.
Yeah.
And what can I say? I mean, that's why I do what I do.
Yeah. And and those were powerful images. And the fact that you played a role in helping put that truth together and explaining it more for the people of Mississippi, because people that lived during that time, a lot of them wanted to live in denial and all that, but for younger generations of people like me to really get those full stories, that was really, really helpful. And Joy Reid has this phrase, she says, scaring is caring. And it's like, when you think about those moments, it was terrifying. But the fact that you and others were able to articulate it so that we can understand and hopefully learn from that, I think was very, very valuable. So Yeah, satisfying was probably the best word I could get. I know rewarding. I didn't know if that was a good word, but yeah, I definitely understand that one. Real quick before we get out, I want you to do two things. One, talk about the current DOJ investigation with the Mississippi Corrections system.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and to back up on time on that, I spent about a year. Well, I've investigated Mississippi prisons twice, like long investigations. I started looking at them in 2013 and we wrote this whole series for the Clarion Ledger. And literally 10 days after we got done with our series, Chris Epps, the head of, Mississippi prisons, was indicted,
Right.
for corruption and went to prison, obviously, for that. And then kind of I went back to, covering other stuff, criminal justice type stuff. And then I started getting calls again from people. It's like, man, the prison's getting worse, from families and people in prison and stuff. So I decided to take another look at it and work with ProPublica for a year. And we started reporting all the horrific things that were happening and in some of the prisons. And basically, the Justice Department started investigating that after, we completed our series. Then it was January of 2020, and they started their investigation a month later. And but now they've investigated 4 prisons in Mississippi, and so Parchman and Central Mississippi Correctional Facility, South Mississippi Correctional Institution in Greene County, and then was at Wilkinson County, which is actually a private prison. So all those they investigated and basically found constitutional violations, like horrible constitutional violations, people being killed and people dying of medical needs, and they're not counting, they're not checking on people, they're not, it's just the regular stuff they used to. They don't even have people in the towers anymore. I mean, that's how bad it's gotten. Like in terms of staffing, they don't even have people in the towers. So it's just, it's a horrific situation, and I have a feeling, unfortunately, that Mississippi's going to wind up in the same spot that Alabama is in terms of they're going to have to build a new prison. I know that Senator Barnett's already talked about that possibility of having a new prison. Well, and he's probably correct in his assessment that we probably need to build it before the feds force us to build it. Whatever the situation. I'm not saying you have to have a new prison, but I'm just saying that I have a feeling that's going to happen, whether Mississippi decides to do it or not, because I think the feds are going to insist that there be better facilities and maybe need a new prison from a standpoint of you can run it with less staff, in terms of design, the way it's designed. And it's just not a good situation in any of these prisons. People that I've talked to that have loved ones in these prisons and stuff.
Right. So final question, because you do a lot on social media highlighting people that were involved in the movement, or you'll highlight particular incidents that happened. Name a historical figure in the civil rights era that you think doesn't get enough recognition.
That's a great question. There are a lot. But one of my favorites, and it's not like, I'll mention 2. Ida B. Wells. Now, people may know Ida B. Wells for her, she's a crusading, essentially, investigative reporter who reported on lynchings and basically had to flee for her life and go to Chicago. They had friends that were lynched in Memphis, and she's from Holly Springs originally. But there are a lot of things about her that people don't know. I mean, the other details about her they don't necessarily know. Like, she refused to give up her leave her train seat because they wanted her to go sit, in the in a place where they were sticking all the black passengers. You know, she was like, no, and she stood up and she won her case actually in court. You know, and or the fact that she marched for women's voting rights. Women's voting rights in with the women who were marching in Washington, and they wanted to stick her in those who came with her, kind of a black delegation from Illinois, and wanted to stick them at the back of the line. And she's like, no, no, either we're going to march with you or we're not a part of you. And so they did. They gave in. And it's like, she's my kind of person. I mean, she stood up for what was right over and over again. I appreciate her crusading journalism and and then of course later helped found the NAACP. So I mean, I like I said, I think people maybe know a little bit about Ida B. Wells, but I bet there's a lot about Ida B. they don't know. And what an incredible, hero. And I'll give another quick example. We typically remember, like, say, Rosa Parks, right? And that's another example along those lines I can use. People know about Rosa Parks, refusing to give up her seat on the bus. But she wasn't even the first black woman in Montgomery to refuse to give up her seat that year.
That's right.
She was the best. And so there were 4 black women in front of her who refused to give up their seats. But she kind of became the symbol for that. So there's so many people like that. Claudette, I forget her last name anyway, but she was a teenager, and she refused to give up her seat, and she was arrested. She was a teenager at the time. And so, but those women, as a result of those women, that's the case that went forward and prompted the desegregation of those buses in Montgomery. It wasn't Rosa Parks, it was those other women. And that's not to take anything away from Rosa Parks. In fact, there's other stuff about we remember Rosa Parks for the bus seat, but they neglect to tell the rest of the story, which is her involvement in the Scottsboro Boys case. She was involved with that. She helped investigate all these cases where white men were raping black women and essentially getting away with it. And so she was a part of the investigations and of those cases. Reese Taylor, I believe, was one of those cases anyway. And so, yeah, it's she deserves a lot of praise, way beyond the bus seat. But we also don't neglect the other women, who were part of that. And so I have a feature that's now running every day, Mississippi Today. It's called On This Day. So every day, and you can even subscribe to it. Every day you can see kind of that day in history. Like today was the day that Hattie McDaniel became the first Black American to win an Oscar. And sometimes she got a little criticism at the time because of the role she played, but those were the only roles available. Like, you have to understand too, Hollywood was pretty racist, so it wasn't like they were handing out, leading roles. And then Monique, when she won her Oscar, literally 70 years later, and when she got up, she wore the exact same type of outfit that Hattie McDaniel wore and thanked her. Yeah. Said because she took on those roles, I'm able to take on the role I was able to take on.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, Jerry, how can people get in touch with you? How can they subscribe to Mississippi Today, all that stuff?
Well, they can go on Mississippi Today and subscribe. In terms of getting in touch with me, people are welcome to email me. My email is Jerry, Jerry, .Mitchell, Mitchell, at Mississippi, all spelled out. And then CIR, that's Center for Investigative Reporting is what that stands for, .org. And if people just email me, I'll be happy to talk to anybody. So.
Well, Jerry, it's obvious that we could talk literally for hours about
Yeah, we talk a while.
all this stuff that you've been involved with. You know, and I was just thinking about you and you know, when I was in Mississippi and we were younger and there was this guy named Bert Case, you know, and everybody was
Oh yeah,
everybody wanted to be Bert Case, you know, or at least be if you got interviewed by Bert Case, you were somebody, you know what I'm saying? So, you know, you kind of got into that echelon now. You're kind of that guy in Mississippi. And so I'm really happy for you. I'm happy to see that you're still doing the work. And
happy to keep doing the work. If people want to read about the civil rights cases, I do have a book. It's called Race Against Time. And it's on, it's in hardback, paperback, audio. And I did get to do the audio myself, so that was fun. I got to do the audio for the book and on Kindle, of course. So yeah,
cool.
It's been quite the journey. But thanks for having me on.
Oh, no problem, man. Like I said, it was an honor, and it's really cool to whenever I can get somebody that I really know,
it's fun, right?
to have that conversation, man. Well,
Yeah.
Jerry, thank you again for coming on.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.
All right, guys, and we'll catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so I want to thank Grace Young Foster, Dan Egol, and Jerry Mitchell for agreeing to come on the podcast and be guests. Again, I hope that y'all were entertained and that y'all learned something from these folks. And I greatly appreciate you all listening and supporting this podcast. Until next time.